Well, good evening, all, and thank you all for joining us in our midweek Bible study. Glad to have you all here and able to pipe in and chime in our chat area in YouTube, and we're grateful for that opportunity to have that. Well, I'd like to invite you, if you would, to get your Bibles, and we're going to be over in Judges chapter 13. Our Wednesday night studies, what we try to do is do studies that require us or allow us to read ahead of time. So I hope you were able to read the assigned reading. Try to put it in the bulletin. I know right now our class material isn't getting out as early as I would like, and I just need to crack down and get that done. But to have that material out ahead even earlier. But our material is always on their website, and you can pull that under our resource tab, and you can check that out there. It also usually gives you the assigned reading. Although, I think this time I had a mistake in there. I think it said Judges 12 when I meant Judges 13, and that was, you just read a chapter extra. Nothing bad, of course, but you did read a little extra there. And we're talking about Judges chapter 13 tonight, and we're going to take a look at this together as we continue in our study of Bible families. And as we're talking about Bible families, one of the things that we're thinking about tonight is how it is that we find different examples of families in the scriptures that give us a good example of how it is we ought to behave or maybe not behave, characteristics of the family, examples from the Bible. The Word of God tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that the things that are written in the Old Testament are written for our understanding. In other words, for us to have a comprehension of certain aspects, particularly the idea of application of the concepts of God's law. And the Old Testament has a fabulous way of revealing to us the way that God looks on men and God's expectations for us. And we oftentimes use that to point to things like authority or righteousness or sacrifice, all these different ideas. Well, the family is something of great importance to us. The Old Testament lays the foundation for the family. We saw that back in Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3 when we talked about that first family, and we saw what the purpose of the family is. Now tonight, as we continue on, we're going to be looking at a family of somebody that we probably know very well. In fact, we studied him about a year ago when we were going through the book of Judges, and that is Samson. Not going to lie, I just find Samson one of the most interesting people in the Bible. In the Old Testament, I just find him interesting. I don't find him somebody that I admire greatly. I just find him fascinating as a guy that he's unusual. I mean, who couldn't love the idea of a real life superhero? I mean, we love to watch movies and read comic books about things like this, and this was the real thing. There really was a superhero once, and it was Samson. And Samson was extraordinary, and he was also terribly flawed. But the Bible tells us a lot about his family. And I think sometimes that's something we pass over. And I tell you what, I think it's worth our time to go back and revisit this. That's kind of what we're doing, since, as I said, about a year ago, we talked about some of these things. But we're going to go back. We're going to camp on the idea of Samson's family tonight. And in doing that, I hope you get some of the sense what makes it so interesting to me to talk about Manoah. And, you know, it never names Samson's mother. It just says it's Manoah's wife. She's a fascinating woman. He's a fascinating man. We know that later on, Samson has brothers. That's at the very end of his story. We find that out. So those are interesting things to consider. But the most important relevance is what we read about with Samson's family. And it all begins there in Judges chapter 13. Now, before we start reading, let me just kind of say this is what I want us to cover tonight. First of all, I want us to take the idea of what we're going to see in Manoah and his wife in the questions that they want to know. How do we raise a child? I think that this is one of the most important conversations a human being has, and I believe it's actually, God that they're talking to here, Jehovah. That's the angel of the Lord in that language, because that's what they think, at least. Maybe not, but that's okay. Let's just say, though, that it is a divine conversation about how do I raise my child. I can't think of something more important than that. Secondly, there's a small bit here that allows us to explore the idea of how important it is that we make wise decisions in regard to making choices about vocations. And then finally, there's also an important point here that we move on out of Judges 13 and into chapter 14 and 15 about the kind of influence that Samson's parents tried to have on him as he was an adult, a man who was a judge of Israel, in fact, and his parents are trying to influence him into righteous behavior. And I think it's important for us to kind of consider for a few moments, how is it that Christians are meant to provide guidance to adult children, whether it's their children or their grandchildren, nieces, nephews? Within that family relationship, we can, of course, we always say we even stretch that out to the idea of the spiritual family, the local church too. How do we give guidance to adults? So let's just kind of pick up and run through this again. Like I said, I hope you had a chance to read this. If you didn't, here's the passages that we're talking about, where there was a certain man from Zorah, and he was of the family of the Danites. One of the neat things about the book of Judges is it shows us judges from a lot of different tribes. And here's the tribe of Dan. And this man's name is Manoah. His wife is barren, has no children. Now, I'm going to come back to that here in just a second. Think about that. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "Indeed, now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now, therefore, please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not to eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." A couple of background points. This term Nazarite that you see here, this is an important word. We've talked about this a lot of different times. It means somebody who is set apart in a particular way. I think it's number 6. Actually, I don't have the verse in front of me, but you read about how it is that in the Old Testament, you could make a pledge to God and you would be set aside. And it doesn't actually specify. I think in the past I've said it was a year, but when I was looking at it just recently, I realized it doesn't actually say how long. It just says for a time. And for a time, you would begin by making this devotion to live a life a specific way. A man or a woman, by the way, could be a Nazarite. And then when you made this vow, at the end of the time, you would shave your head and you would take the hair that you had and you would offer that at the temple as a living sacrifice, or as a sacrifice of a part of you. I love this because it's so interesting to think about the idea of growing out your hair and then shaving it off. This seems to be referenced a couple of times in the New Testament. Paul, in Acts chapter 21, pays the vows for some men going to the temple for this, or pays for their time in the temple. It seems like maybe that's what it is. Seems like maybe Paul himself might have taken this vow. It's a significant vow. Now, let me just say this to think about it. If you were a woman and you made this vow, what would it be like to shave your head? I mean, that's a serious thing, right? To be asked to do something like that. I think today that would be something that would raise a few eyebrows. That's kind of funny. But that would be something that would just be a real surprise to do. Let's go back to this Nazarite thing, though, and let's think about this for a second. This is different because this one's going to be a Nazarite from birth. Now, remember from our study, there are 3 people. Try to get my 3s in front of the camera. There are 3 people in the Bible who were Nazarites from birth, or at least we kind of infer they were. Number 1, and I'll tell you what, I'll grab our verses here so you can follow those along. Number 1, it is Samson, whom we're reading about here. Number 2 was Samuel, the last of the judges, by the way. And a lot of people, by the way, think that Samson and Samuel might have been judges about the same time or close to the same time. Could be. But Samuel is the second man who was from birth a Nazarite. And then a lot of people look at the language in Luke chapter 1 and verse 15 in regards to Elizabeth and John the Baptist and the things that she was directed to do. Now, what's interesting about this is that in each of these circumstances, we saw a very similar story, right? A barren woman, she couldn't have children. She's promised a child, but that child has to be set apart from the womb, becomes something very great. I don't want to elaborate too much on that. We did that, as I said, about a year ago, but it is interesting to consider. Maybe one other thing to consider too is this really makes a case for the idea that from the womb, God is mindful of the life of a person. And of course, some might believe that no, it's not from the womb, it's from birth, it's from the first breath of life, whatever the scientists who have no credibility to tell us where life begins. The Word of God seems to indicate here's a good example that even before they're born, a child is consecrated before God. A child is in the image of God. A child has this divine life given by God. So that's something worth considering here in this circumstance. So when we see this story, of course, we read about how, first of all, in this story, they come to the woman. The woman goes to her husband, Manoah, and Manoah does something really important, something that I think is of great value for us to consider. You read there in verse 8, Manoah prayed to the Lord. So he hears this message. They're going to have a child. They're going to have a son. That's great news. But no, Manoah, picture him if you would. He gets down on his knees. He begins to pray and he says, "Oh Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent come to us again and teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born." Let me just say, I think that this is a tremendously important idea. Parenting doesn't come naturally. Did you get that? Parenting doesn't come naturally. Not everybody is just naturally a good parent. Instead, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to be inheriting a degree of understanding about how children should be raised and how they should be brought up. And the Word of God has a lot to say about that. There's a lot of conversations about how it is that we are to raise our children. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in Ephesians chapter 6, raising our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. But the point is, here is a very wise father who realizes, I need to know what God expects of me. And I find it fascinating that verse 9 says there that God listened to the voice of Manoah and the angel came back. And this time he comes out there to Manoah's wife, to Samson's mother, and she runs in. She says that he's back. And they go out there, and verse 12, there's this super important question. Manoah says, "Let your words come to pass," meaning Manoah's saying that's a good thing. And he says, "What will be the boy's rule of life and his work?" I think this is an important point. In fact, I wanted to grab up maybe a different translation here for you to consider for just a second. New American Standard, it says his mode of life as opposed to his rule of life, his vocation, and his rule and his work. And I want to say that these are tremendously important ideas. Two ideas that I want to consider. Number one, how do we consider the understanding of the purpose which we have for children, grandchildren, those with us, these kinds of things? Number two, going to come back to this here in just a moment. What is a parent's responsibility in helping their children to find vocation, a job, work? What is that responsibility? Let's kind of go over a couple of questions if we can there. I'm going to throw them up out here for you to consider for just a moment. Maybe somebody can throw those in the chat for me. What are some common purposes that people in the world direct their children to pursue? Does that question make sense to you? What are some of the things that people in the world would purpose their children in order to achieve in their life? And second part of that question is, what ought we who are in Christ be purposing our children? I guess the second one's really easy, right? And maybe you may just choose not to answer it. But the first one, I want you to think about this for a second, because what's interesting about that first question is I think a lot of times godly parents miss the mark on this because they start thinking about the worldly things. Oh, I got some good answers already. Let's grab them. First of all, I see here that Teresa says careers, wealth, prestige, which she puts down as power, influence, politics, fame, whatever makes them happy. Okay, Teresa, fantastic. Especially as Americans, it seems to be more of an American thing that I hear parents all the time say, all I really want for my children is for them to be happy. That's terrible, because the pursuit of happiness is not wise, and it's not satisfying, and it's not something that really is something we ought to design ourselves for. And the world doesn't get that. And a lot of times Christian parents don't get that. And they'll say things like, I just want my kids to grow up to be happy. No, you want them, well, I won't give it away. You're going to tell me in a second. But we want their success. She said it's careers, it's wealth. Right. We really push our kids to have good jobs. We say that's what it's all about. Get a good job. And sometimes godly parents miss the mark on this. I hope you're listening, especially if you've still got children in your home and you still have some influence. But even if not, if you've got grandchildren or others, you're still influencing them. That's an important idea we've talked about. And one of the terrible things we influence people is we sometimes think it's all about getting a good job. That's success. Some parents lower the standard, and I won't say that because I want to see if somebody else grabs that point. So yeah, that's a great one. George says, many parents direct their, let me grab this real quick. Many parents direct their attention towards obtaining fame and fortune, thinking this is the way to success. Again, money. You both have mentioned money now, and money is a big one that people push their children to obtain. Now, Teresa, I'm going to come back to it because you've got the right answer for the second part of this. George, you do too. Here's Lamar. Lamar says, worldly direction points children to vocation that may lead to worldly riches or prestige. So right away, you guys are really picking up the right direction here. That the most common thing most worldly parents do is they want their kids, and with, let's say, good intention, they want their kids to be financially successful. That's the big focus. And there's nothing wrong with being financially successful. And in fact, I'm going to say, in fact, our second point is going to be we should encourage our children to pursue vocations that will sustain them. That's going to be an important point to come to here in just a few moments. But right now, what I want us to see is we believe sometimes that's the purpose of life, or we act like it. We act like that's the thing that matters the most, is that you do well in school so that you can get a good job, or whatever it might be, that you've got to pursue things that bring you financial success. That's the world's view. Debbie Watkins says happiness is important. And I agree, Debbie, you're right. Happiness is important, but she goes on to say, but it is much further down the list than the world puts it. And you're right, because the world, I would say, I don't know, Debbie, if this is what you meant, but I would say the world says happiness is number one. And happiness is not number one. And as you said, much further down the list than that. That's an important point for us to consider. Worldly influence is worldly. Rob, I assume when you say that there, you're implying the idea that it focuses on the things in the world. Jesus, and you quote Matthew 6:19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. So the point is that it's the case that a lot of times what we want to do is we want to store up for ourselves treasures on earth, and we want to encourage others to do the same, even with good intentions. Grant says this, many parents place carrying on a family business or tradition above raising godly children, and then Grant goes on to say, or even their child's well-being. Now, it's interesting, Grant, because, of course, even in times past or in other countries, even today, it was often the case that your expectation was you were to pursue the vocation of your father. Now, by the way, I've always thought that's interesting in saying that, because that would have been Manoah's first inclination. Oh, this guy's going to be whatever I'm doing. Whatever Manoah does is what his son is going to do. It doesn't tell us what Manoah does, but it does say that they have, it talks about us being in fields, so we assume they're farmers. And it's interesting that Manoah didn't just say, oh, God's going to give me a son, and he's going to work the fields with me. Times past, people thought having lots of children was a great thing because he had lots of people to work in the field with you. But Manoah doesn't see it that way. I hope you caught that Manoah is a really wise person to say, God, what do you want him to do? And that's, again, I don't want to give away too much for our next point, but that's such an important idea of what it is that we're doing. And Grant says, a lot of times the focus is to sustain me. Now, I've always said it's important that our children understand they will need to take care of us. But a lot of times parents have just brought children in the world just for the things that they bring. I want you to think about that for a second. Sometimes it's just the pleasure of having children. I've known people that love having babies, but don't like having adolescents, and really don't like having teenagers. Can't imagine why. Really don't like having teenagers, but they love to have babies because it just brings them a personal pleasure. And that's not the best reason that we should be thinking about what we want the purpose of our children to be. Just to bring us a satisfaction is not good enough. And there's a lot of times where parents just want their children to bring them satisfaction. And let's think about that. I've got another question for you to think about after that first one. And by the way, let me step back and say, what's the answer to the second part of that, where we said that the question is, what ought Christians to do? Teresa said, learn God's will, live accordingly to make Him, that is God, happy. Right on. That's exactly right. To please Him, to be acceptable to Him. That's the purpose. George says, Christians need to direct their attention to the things that are truly important. Bible knowledge, faith in God, purity, our eternal hope. Lamar says Christians should point their children to be good providers who do their work as to the Lord and has enough to share with others to help in their needs. It's a good point. A very good point. We're going to come back to some of that point here in just a moment. So all of these are really good comments to consider. I want to ask another question now. Let's ask this. If we understand, and I think, like I said, everybody probably understood what the answer to the question was, but I appreciate you gave us some good wording for that. What are the sacrifices that we need to make in order to see that those purposes are going to be achieved? Now, we don't get to have a long conversation about Manoah and his wife and what sacrifices they make for their son's benefit or welfare. But we do see, like, we're going to come in a few weeks and talk about Hannah, who's the mother of Samuel, that other man that I mentioned a moment ago, might be a Nazarite from birth, and she's going to make some pretty extraordinary sacrifices of her son. That's important to think about. What kind of sacrifices are necessary, though? What does a family need to commit to the idea of in order to ensure that the purposes, let's go back and remind ourselves, to learn God's will, to live accordingly, to direct attention to things that are truly important, spiritual things, to point their children to be righteous providers? What kinds of sacrifices might be necessary? Okay, so Teresa's got an answer here. She says financial, social, worldly pleasures and pursuits. You know, it's interesting. I know a lot of times I've known parents who, and I'm going to grab a couple of those points, Teresa. You said financial, selfish parents who just want things for themselves. They're always going to fail at being successful parents. Whenever you're selfish, well, you're probably going to fail at just about everything. Whenever you're selfish, you're not prepared to make financial sacrifices to ensure that those with you have what they need. Worldly pleasure, pursuit, friends. You know, when one of the things that we do when we get older is we have less and less engagement with certain social groups sometimes that, brought us pleasure in the past because we're focused on successfully raising our children. So that's a true point as well. Daria says personal happiness may need to be sacrificed. You know, Daria, you're right. Happiness is expendable. And I know that doesn't always sound great, but it's true. Your happiness, and happiness, by the way, I don't mean joy. I mean the idea of how you feel right now. The idea, and sometimes, they use the term instant gratification. The idea of just feeling an immediate sense of pleasure or joy has to be put off so that success can come. Now, that's true in everything. But Daria, as you say that, it's a great point because it speaks to the idea that a lot of times parenting is not a happy thing. How many parents can say that? It's not happy when I have to, discipline my kids, when I have to go to meetings with my kids, take them places, do things for them. They're not things that I may enjoy. I have taken my kids to some movies that I wanted to pull my eyeballs out. Sacrifices sometimes have to be made. And that's not really a very legitimate sacrifice, but the point is, sometimes my pleasure has to come very far away in order to ensure that they're going to succeed. A few more comments here. Let me grab them. George says, it takes time, effort, unity, and perseverance. You know, George, it's interesting about that. I'm going to guess that when you say unity, you actually mean the unity of the home. Right on. That's a great comment about that idea. Debbie says, Mom may stay at home even though working might benefit the family financially. That's a great point. That a lot of times the financial pursuit might need to be sacrificed in order for success in the home. Sure, that's a great point. Monique says desire to do so. What sacrifices is necessary? The desire to sacrifice. That's a great point. Not all parents do, and commitment. You know, Monique, I wish we could sit on that comment a little longer. The idea that there's a lot of people that just don't desire to sacrifice for their children. We were studying in another study this morning in the book of Romans, chapter 13, and it came up about Job's sacrifices in Job chapter 1, about his children and how he sacrificed for them. And he sacrificed for all these children that he had. I think it was 10 children total. And that's a lot of sacrificing. And he did so because he was worried for them. So he sacrificed a lot of his things, his animals, his livestock, in order to ensure that they might not be held accountable for anything. That's important, that we make those sacrifices. Next comment. Stan says, we need to show our children by our example what is important to us. How much effort do we put into being a good Christian? Stan, that's a fantastic comment. In fact, that comment, I tell you what, Stan, I'm going to hold that comment and come back to it because that really even goes well with the next question too. Michael Hetzer, we need to sacrifice everything in order to put God first. Period. Well done, Michael. We need to sacrifice everything. If there's anything, if we're to put God first in our life, we need to sacrifice everything. Everything else must come after our service to God. So there isn't really a question about, in regards to our sacrifices before God, that if we're putting God first in our family, in our home, that is the best choice we can make as a family. Do you agree with that? I know you do. That putting God first in your home, in the home, is the best decision any family can make. And Michael Hetzer said it well when he says, and therefore anything should be sacrificed to that end. Okay, that's real important. Anything ought to be sacrificed in order to achieve that godly home. Now, when I say anything, I guess I should step back and say I don't mean things like, well, we should sacrifice our marriage or our time with the saints. Obviously not the things that belong to God, the things God has called us to do. But anything that's us has to be on the table. Right on. Fathers and mothers need to train their children to first love the Lord. So many people find out later that though they may have brought their children to church, they don't stay. Stan, it's a great point. That a lot of times the problem is they haven't really loved the Lord. They just compelled them, and sometimes even stand for bad reasons because they just don't want to be embarrassed by their children. They compel them to be there and to sit and be quiet and not to know God and to love God. When things like that happen, a lot of times, you're right, Stan, sometimes that results in people who walk away and they don't really love God. That's a great comment for us to consider. One more question. This is an easy one, and I'm almost tempted to just throw it out there and answer it myself. In what ways can we aid? This is it. In what ways can we aid in the purpose of any or all of the children of our congregation? Well, Stan said something earlier I want to go back to. He said we need to show our children by an example what is important to us. And that's exactly right. Children, I've said this many times, children have fantastic hypocrisy detectors. Let me say it again. Children have fantastic hypocrisy detectors. They can tell when we're being hypocritical. And the important point we need to consider is that we ought to be genuine in our affection for the church, for the saints, and for God. Teresa throws it out there. She says, teach them God's will. Guide them in making wise decisions. Support and encourage them. Rebuke and train as needed. Great points. Great points there. George says, show them by our example how to make applications of the truth that we've been taught. A good one, George. Show by example, applying the truth. Show by example how we apply the truth. Fantastic. Engage them. Be involved in their lives. Monique, that's important. And the idea is that in spiritual involvement in their life kind of goes along with Manoah and his wife and their engagement and their involvement in their son's life that we're going to pick up in the next chapter. Tell you what, I'm going to move a little more quickly just so we can get to that point. I'm going to grab this next question and just say, how is it that parents who purpose to raise spiritually minded children are blessed? Well, they're blessed that they have the best possible outcome within their home, and they're blessed by having that certainty that they have successfully done the will of God on these things. Let's go to the second point here, if you would. The point that we go on to say that Manoah asked another question. Manoah had asked what should be his vocation, his work. And we said before that one of the great purposes of the family is preparing children to leave, to go, to leave home and to become adults and to make decisions as adults. Those are spiritual purposes, but they're also part of that is preparing them for their vocational purposes. You know, actually earlier, I'm trying to find Lamar's comment. Lamar said Christians should point their children to be good providers who do their work as to the Lord. And that's exactly right. That's why it is that we're supposed to be involved in our children's career choices. Now, what I mean by that is that we're supposed to help direct them in the choices that they're going to be making. Why do some parents fail in that? I'm going to answer this one, I think. And I answer both of these to kind of get us started off, again, for the sake of time. Why do some parents fail to prepare their children for a vocation? Because a lot of times we live in a country where people say things like, well, I want to let them choose. I'm going to just let them find themselves and find what they want to do. That's not wise. Again, the idea, you've probably heard the old saying that the problems in my life is that the most important decisions that affected my life the most were made by an 18-year-old, is the idea that maybe sometimes we're not totally equipped early on to make these decisions that have these long-lasting impacts. We want good advice. We want to be able to give good advice. How do some parents fail? They say, just do what makes you happy. That's not good advice. Good advice is find something that doesn't prevent you from serving God. Find something that doesn't prevent you from fulfilling your family obligations. Find something that, like Lamar said, enables you to be a good provider. Sometimes, life throws you curves and you're not able to pursue the things you set yourself up to, but that's the kind of thing that we need to think about. Not things like make the most money or, the most success or make you happy. Find things that will make you successful spiritually. Jobs that don't make you travel on Sunday and miss that time, be gone, or be that you're working shifts Sunday or things like that. Avoid those things. Those are the things we would want to encourage people to do. To say, hey, don't let your vocation overwhelm you spiritually. How's this different for sons or daughters? Was the second question. Well, I think probably some of the point there is that what we're trying to do is encourage our sons to become heads of households and our daughters to become managers of households, to become helpmeets. And one of the great mistakes I think a lot of times parents make is that if they have a daughter, they say, well, she doesn't need to have a job. She's just going to get married. That's terrible reasoning. There's so many reasons why you're not equipping somebody to be a helpmeet if you're saying all you've got to do is show up in life and that's the success that you're going to have. As I said, I wish I could spend a little more time on that question, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead. And let's ask a more practical question. How? I want you to think about this. How can we guide young adolescent children pursuing a wise vocation? How can we do that? I messed Grant up there earlier that he was trying to follow my questioning here, but I had to skip ahead a few. But I want you to consider this. How do we guide the young people in our congregation in pursuing wise vocations? And think about this in a broader sense. How do we guide, say, Kate Foster, versus Daria Haynes? Or how do we guide, I don't know, Caleb Willis as opposed to Jonathan Hetzer? You know, how do we guide people at different ages? What are some things that we ought to do? Here's Teresa's comment about this. Teresa says, weighing the pros and cons of whatever they're interested in and discussing how that vocation might glorify God in their life. You know, I had a lot of vocational desires years ago. Let me tell you a story. This actually involves Sylvia, Sylvia's husband, Larry. Remember, not most of you never had the blessing to get to meet Larry, but I remember I wanted to pursue a career in law enforcement after college. I was thinking about that, and Larry had been a lifelong Arizona State Trooper. And he pulled me aside and he said, well, let me tell you, he said, if you're going to pursue that and balance that with being a Christian, there's aspects of that life you're going to have to strongly avoid. He gave me such great advice. I kind of quit looking for that because I thought, you know what, it really is a lot more sacrifices than I realized it was going to be, and puts me in a lot of ways where I thought, you know, I'm not sure I want to do this. He didn't intend to talk me out of it, but he wanted me to be well advised with good advice as to how I should move forward in my life. And I've never forgot that advice. And I've always thought how fortunate I was to have somebody who pulled me aside and said, let me give you some career advice that wasn't meant to be discouraging. He was just trying to tell me the choices I would need to be prepared to make if I wanted to be both spiritual and successful in a law enforcement vocation. So what do you think? What are some other comments we've got here? Well, it looks like I don't have too many other comments to think about here. That's okay. For the sake of time, we're going to move on anyway. And if you throw a comment in there, I'll grab it here in just a moment. And maybe we'll just skip this next question, which was, how does Paul's admonition that you are paid for a price, don't become slaves of men, fall into consideration? Well, I would just say, don't take up a vocation that takes control of your life. Always understand some vocations demand more of you than others, and you need to be careful. That was, in fact, some of the advice that Larry was giving me when he was giving me that good advice. So let's move on then. And what I want to do now is I want to jump on to chapter 14 in the book of Judges. And here it is that Samson's about to get married. He saw a woman in Timnah, the daughter of the Philistines, and he goes to his mother and father. Here they are, verse 2. And he says, I've seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all my people, that you may go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she pleases me. His father and mother did not know it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over all Israel. By the way, let me kind of step back for a second. Debbie gave another good comment. She said, with young children, we're building the foundation. But with high school or older children, we're building the structure of their life. Debbie, that's actually a really good observation of the distinctions of what we're doing, say, for example, even in our Bible studies, our Bible classes that we hold, the different distinction between the foundation and the structure. I really think it's a good point. So here we have Manoah and his wife, and they're trying to give their son good advice. He wants to get married. We said before, that's one of the things that we're trying to purpose our children towards, is having a godly marriage. But ironically, he doesn't listen to anything they say. They gave him very good advice, and he simply does not listen. And I thought that's an interesting thing, because I think that part of the point to consider here is that we're learning a lesson from this family. Here's the points I want you to think about. Number one, there comes a point in the lives of our children, a lot of us have seen it come and understand what I mean, that we're merely advisors, that we're not anything more than people who can give them advice. We don't have any ability to dictate to them. And like I said, I think logically we know this, but emotionally a lot of times we don't really feel this. But there comes a point where we're only advisors to the children that we know, whether they're the young people at church, whether they're our children, our grandchildren. All we can do is give advice. And that's not something that a lot of us are very good at. to be honest. A lot of people aren't good about giving advice because sometimes, number one, they give bad advice. Or number two, they give advice badly. That they don't really have a good way to have a conversation. Again, I step back to my example of the brother in Christ who gave me good advice, and he did so in a way that really helped me to think through a really tough decision. The second thing I think the problem or the point we want to consider is that if we understand that we're going to reach a time where we're just advisors after a certain point, we need to be preparing a foundation for that role. You know, that's a really hard thing for us to see. Teresa, thanks, by the way, for grabbing that and dropping it back into the chat so we can keep looking at this. But I think for a lot of parents, that way I can kind of go off and talk to you a little bit about this. I think a lot of times as parents, we kind of reach a point, especially as our kids are getting older, that we just want to finish. We don't want to get across the finish line and enjoy that success. And we fail to realize that one of the things we need to be doing is setting up with our children as they're getting older, a foundation for our part in their life as an advisor, as somebody who can give them good advice. And hopefully we're going to have good advice. I think lots of people do have good advice. Maybe some have more than others. But the point is, are we really preparing ourselves in a way that sets that role up in our life? So let me ask you, how do we do that? Not a tremendous amount of time. I want to say that here's Lamar's comment. Actually, here, let me step back. Here I've got a comment from Stan. Stan says, to prepare our children, we need to help them learn the basic skills they need around the house, yard, cooking, cleaning, etc. Give them some chores. You know, it's interesting, Stan, I've several times remarked that there's certain things that a person ought to be able to do by the time they're 18 as a measure of their success as an individual. And that's a neat point. These are some of the things that we're laying that advice for. Lamar says parents should discipline their children and expect obedience. As adults, the relationship shifts to mutual respect and advisor. Lamar, what you said is real important. Because that expectation, Lamar, you're right on. That expectation of obedience dissolves over time. There's not an expectation that they're going to do everything we tell them to do. Like you said, when they're younger, that is what they're supposed to do. The Word of God says, children, obey your parents. But as they get older, that expectation of obedience diminishes. And this opportunity or foundation that hopefully we're laying even now for advisor, that opportunity is being established because that's the role it goes into. As adults, the relationship shifts to mutual respect and advisor. And that's exactly right. And by the way, I think one of the mistakes that we make is to believe that this just shifts overnight. You know, on your 18th birthday, not going to tell you what to do anymore, but I'll just give you advice. Well, that's not true. You have to shift that through adolescence and even into adulthood, those changes, so to speak, especially depending a lot on the characteristics of your children, because no two children are the same. And one of the worst things we do sometimes is we say, well, you know, their kids did this or didn't do that. My kids should or shouldn't. Don't worry about other kids. You know, your kids are different. That's one of the most obvious and yet forgotten things that we look at a lot, is that everybody's kids are different. And that measure of how that change occurs from you've got to obey everything I say to let me advise you and suggest to the choice you're going to make, that we have to be able to discern that with them. Anthony's got let me step back. Teresa's got a comment here. She says, this requires patience, understanding, teaching, training, listening, and discipline. She says the verbal rebuke and at times physical grounding, removing privileges, etc. Consistency, no mixed messages. So right off the top, when we're talking about our younger children in particular, all of these things come to that of laying a foundation. So we're laying a foundation when they're younger of our authority. But let me say this, one of the important ideas, and let me be careful because I know all of us have said it, I've said it, is that there reaches a point in the lives of our children where our saying, because I said so, actually works against us. that at the point where that transition is being made between the child who's committed to obedience and the child who's becoming one who we advise, if we miss that mark and we're still trying to say, because I said so is the reason my advice is good, we will not succeed. And that's a tough one. It's tough to make that transition to get to that point in life. Here is Anthony's comment. Anthony says, we're always parents to our children, no matter how old they are, and give them advice or rebuke as needed. That's right. You know, the idea is that advice, but when my children are small, I'm not really giving them advice, of course. I'm telling them what to do. And the trick is learning that point when I've got to transition, as you said, because they're always going to be in a place where I would want them to want my advice. When I'm on my deathbed, I hope I'll be setting an example that I want my kids to follow. That's important. In fact, by the way, probably your deathbed is one of the best examples you could set. How you approach the end of your life is super important. If you want your children to be faithful, if your children aren't faithful now and you want them to be faithful one day, how you approach the end of your life is a big consideration on that. That's a huge consideration you need to consider about influence your children. But the point is that concept of advising our children as they get older, that we need to be proper examples to them. Here's Wendy's comment. She says, we need to have established a relationship that will lead to them being receptive to advice and guidance. And that's really it, right? That what we need to do is to change our relationship. We're not, as I said, we're not the dictators anymore where we say you do this because I said so. That slow transition is we tell you to do this and then explaining why. And then pretty soon it's we would suggest you do this. We would advise you to do this. And hopefully that transition, as you said, Wendy, it's by that relationship that we've created that they have come to respect our opinions. Of course, the Word of God says they're supposed to respect, but oftentimes if we have failed to be people by our conduct and behavior that respect is in the decisions we make is good. I said before, a lot of times people don't give good advice or they don't give advice well. That the point is that we've got to learn how to effectively establish that relationship that we want to have. And that kind of brings us to the next question. And for the sake of time, actually, we are just about out of our time. How can we make our adult children desire our advice? And a lot of that comes back to, as Wendy said, what we want to do is we want to be able to wisely advise them. The last question that I had there, what are examples of parents who failed to successfully move into a role of advisor? I think that's a loaded question, a lot of different answers you could have put there. And I was kind of hoping we'd get to that so you could kind of tell me some examples or some ideas. When you see people who, when the time came and their parents wanted to give them good advice, they wouldn't listen. But I think maybe the best example is right here. Whenever his father and mother in verse 3 said, this isn't a good idea, that their son didn't listen. You know, Samson had a lot of problems in his life. He had a lot of behavioral issues. And verse 3, his parents trying to give him advice, it just didn't work. We don't know why he wouldn't listen. Of course, it tells us that the Lord sought an opportunity to provoke, but that doesn't tell us why Samson wouldn't listen. That's something worth considering. There's lots of times in life where people say, you know, I wish my adult children would listen to what I have to say about how they're raising their children, about how they're living their lives. And that has to be established by a relationship where they respect our advice and it's understood between them and us that our role is no longer as the authoritarian. Our role is now as an advisor. And we should hope we establish relationships where they want that advice. Well, we've run out of time. I kind of wish we could have dwelled on this last one longer, but we're certainly already past our time. If we were in our normal services, somebody would have already rung the bell at me and a trillion children would have run out and overwhelmed me. So I have to stop here. But I'm so grateful everybody's comments. It had some fantastic comments tonight. A lot of things for us to think about here. Really appreciate your time. You're visiting with us. We're so glad you took the time out of your day to spend an hour with us or just under an hour with us in our study. You want to look back at other class materials, we have those on the website. We'd invite you to pull those out and take a look at them if you ever get a chance. Thanks so much, and may God bless you in this week.